The Ocucor is the top secondary weapon in Warframe, having eliminated a collective 4.2 billion enemies in 2024. That's a whole lot of zeros. But the reason I want to talk about it today is not the usage stats, but because many of you have brought it up under the recent Kuva Nukor video asking which pistol is better. So, in today's Warframe guide, I'm not only going to tell you everything you need to know about the Ocucor plus builds and everything, but we will also find out which of these two iconic handguns reign supreme in 2025. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now, well, let's jump right into it. Alright, so first things first, where do you even get the Ocucor from if you don't have it already? Luckily, this is pretty simple. Just head over to the Corpus lab of your clan's dojo, there you can research the blueprint, and then you can simply build it in your foundry for a couple of Fortuna materials. However, you might wonder, why would you even want to have the Ocucor? And that neatly leads us over to the next topic, which would be, how does the Ocucor work and what can it even do? Let's take a look. The Ocucor is a fully automatic beam pistol similar to the Kuva Nukor. You have a nice fire rate compared with good status chance, however when it comes to the crit values, it's not complete garbage to the point that you don't want to build for it in the first place, but it's definitely below average. As for the damage, well, you get innate radiation, but the numbers here, at least on paper, are extremely pathetic. However, the Ocucor does have one special feature which kinda sort of makes up for this. Here's what I mean. The Ocucor has a special ability. Whenever you take out an enemy with the Ocucor, you get an additional beam in form of a tendril, which does the exact same damage and shares the same stats as the main beam, but it automatically locks on to another nearby target. You can have up to 4 of these tendrils active at the same time, however the catch here is that once you have to reload, all the tendrils get cancelled and need to be built up again. Now, one very important thing to note here is, if there is only one target nearby so that the tendrils can't lock on to any other enemies, the game makes it look like they're actually all homing into the same target, which suggests the weapon would deal 5 times the damage, but in reality, this is just a visual effect and those extra tendrils can't lock on to the same enemy, so if they don't find any target, then you're essentially wasting their damage potential, making it very clear that the Ocucor isn't a single target weapon, but one that is to be used in larger crowd scenarios. Okay, we now know what the Ocucor does. It's actually pretty darn simple. Take out enemies, get rewarded with more tendrils, which will then lead to you eliminating even more. However, before we get into the build section, there is one very specific mod that we need to talk about in a little more detail. And that mod is Ocucor specific and goes by the name Sentient Surge. Sentient Surge originally came into the game as a Nightwave mod available from Nightwave Nora's Mix Volume 4. In case you missed this Nightwave, you can also obtain it from the Knights of Nabarus event, which is the Halloween event that we get every year, but outside of these 2 occasions, if you don't have it, you gotta buy it from another player. It's not too expensive anymore though. What Sentient Surge does and why it is so special is that whenever you eliminate an enemy, that will automatically refill 20% of your current magazine. And remember, the up to 4 tendrils that you can have active at the same time always reset when you have to reload, and that means with Sentient Surge, you can make it that your magazine will never empty out and therefore those tendrils will be constantly up, significantly increasing your damage output. But wait, there is more. In addition to this reload feature, which is already very nice, the mod also gives you 60% crit and status chance for every active tendril. Or in other words, with the maximum of 4 tendrils, which you will have active pretty much constantly, that is plus 240% crit chance, plus 240% status chance, and unlimited ammo without reloading, all combined in one single mod. This thing, without exaggeration, is so incredibly strong that it literally makes or breaks the weapon. If you don't have this mod, there isn't even a point in playing the Ocucor in the first place. Oh yeah, and by the way, if you could maybe drop the video a like, that would be super nice because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so big kisses for that. Okay. So the funny thing with the build section of this video is, as it turns out, there is so much build variety on this weapon that I had to prepare 4 full builds for you. And I'm fully aware that you're gonna kill me if I start rambling on about every single mod on every single build, so instead how we're gonna handle it in this video is as follows. First of all, right now, we're gonna talk about the build core. This is sort of a base foundation shared by all 4 builds that I'm about to present to you. And after that, I'm going to show you the 4 full builds right away with a couple suggestions as to which scenarios these builds might best be used in. So here we go. With the Ocucor, our main base damage is not going to come from Hornet Strike. Instead, we use Galvanized Shot to not only further increase our status chance, but also because on the substat, it gives us more base damage too, and then we combine that, naturally, with more multi-shot from Galvanized Diffusion. Up next, we of course use the Augment Sentient Surge that we just talked about, simply because it's absolutely mandatory to make this weapon work, and the last 2 mandatory ones would be a faction damage mod as well as more crit damage. Now, you might be wondering, why only mod for crit damage and not crit chance? And the answer here is actually pretty darn simple. Because the Sentient Surge Augment already gives you 240% crit chance, that means if we were to add another crit chance mod, we would kind of get diminishing returns, and given the fact that the base crit stats are already not that awesome, I personally think doubling down into crit chance on this gun is simply not worth it. But yeah, long story short, this right here is the build core which I think every single Ocucor build will be based upon. But alright, let's now talk about the 4 builds that I have prepared for you today, and here I want to start out with a direct damage build. In my case, it's direct corrosive against Grineer, followed by a pure heat damage over time build, then thirdly a sort of hybrid build where we go into corrosive and heat at the same time, and lastly, of course, as with every high fire rate, high status chance weapon in the game, we also have to test out a blast build, of course. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and start out with a direct damage build first. This right here is my corrosive build, where I added 2 90% elemental mods to construct corrosive. I didn't go for the 60/60 mods because with Galvanized Shot and Sentient Surge, we already have over 300% status chance boost, so I think going into more elemental damage here is the way to go. And lastly, I went for Lethal Torrent because it not only gives me even more multi-shot and therefore more damage, but also the plus 60% fire rate is really nice here. Since you don't have to reload due to the augment, 60% more fire rate instantly equates to 60% more damage over time, and that is really darn strong here. And just in case you're wondering why there is no arcane here, we do have to talk about the arcane separately in a minute because there is a lot to dive into. Up next though, this here would be my damage over time pure heat build, where of course, since it is damage over time, we have to use Pistol Elementalist, and then I went for primed heated charge to add the heat in the first place. This right here then is a combined corrosive heat build against Grineer, where I dropped out the Elementalist mod for primed convulsion to have a ton of corrosive damage as well as heat, so it's kind of sort of the best of both worlds. You're stripping away enemy armor while at the same time dealing DOT, which double dips due to the faction mod, and I found this one to be an actually pretty darn good performing build. Just keep in mind though, if you're not up against Grineer who are weak to corrosive, or your Warframe has an ability with which you can reduce the armor, then I think it would be cleverer to go for viral heat instead of corrosive heat, but that of course always comes down to the rest of your loadout. And finally, this right here would be my blast build. Again, faction mod and elementalist are absolute musts here. As to which of these builds is the strongest one, it of course always comes down to the scenario. If you have a reliable grouping ability in your loadout, then blast pretty much in every scenario will be objectively the best choice. However, in my personal testing on base level Steel Path, the heat DOT, the corrosive and the corrosive heat build kinda sorta performed similarly against Grineer, so I would say it comes down to personal preference. However, as I'm sure you noticed, all these build screenshots were without arcane, and the reason I showcased those builds without arcanes is because there are so many different options that you could use here, so I simply wanted to talk about them separately. Here's what I mean. Since the Ocucor is a high fire rate, high status chance weapon, what you can always do is use the arcane secondary Encumber, which has a 24% chance to give you an additional random status effect whenever the weapon itself causes a status effect. This can put an insane amount of different elements onto the enemy, which then means you would get a ton of base damage out of Galvanized Shot, namely after 3 kills, plus 120% more base damage per each and every individual status type. This needs a second or two to ramp up to really get all those status effects going, but then the Ocucor doesn't even hit like a truck, it hits like a freaking freight train. However, this is not all. If you use one of the two heat-based build, you could also use Cascadia Flare, which only caps out at plus 480% base damage, so theoretically with secondary encumber you could get higher. But the positive here is it doesn't need to ramp up, you just instantly get the damage as soon as the enemy is affected by heat, which, you know, with those builds, happens basically instantly. But there are even more arcanes that we could use. For example, the also new Secondary Innervate. Given the fact that the Ocucor doesn't have all too high of a base crit chance, what we could do is go for Secondary Innervate to massively increase our crit chance, just like in my Kuva Nukor build, to get tons of orange and even the occasional red crits out of this. Yes, that means that in comparison to the other two arcanes, you would lose out on a lot of base damage, but through your Galvanized Shot, you're at least gonna have some base damage anyway, and the added crit chance that Secondary Innervate gives you definitely is also nothing to scoff at. And as if that's not enough, there's even a fourth arcane, this being Cascadia Empowered, which makes it that whenever you trigger a status effect, you get an additional instance of plus 750 flat damage of that element in addition to that. So, the obvious question would be, which arcane is the best here? And when it comes to that, I want to start out with Cascadia Empowered, where, according to my testing, this one, although not bad, did have a significantly weaker performance than the other three, so we can safely sort that out. As for the other ones, I did run some simulacrum tests, testing all those three on the Heat DOT build, on the Corrosive build, as well as on the Mixed build, and while you might spot a little difference or two in the footage here, a lot of this could also simply come down to sheer luck. So in my opinion, as long as you're just running base level Steel Path, it doesn't make all too much of a difference which of these arcanes you finally choose. Just one trend that I could imagine would be, if you were to take the Ocucor into higher levels, I think Secondary Encumber will at some point start noticeably outpacing Cascadia Flare, because, you know, Cascadia Flare is capped at 480% damage, whereas Secondary Encumber will lead to more and more damage the more status effects it manages to stack up, so against higher level targets that can take more damage, this also means you have more damage ramp-up potential than with the flat-out capped Cascadia Flare. As for Secondary Innervate, I think the main pro here is that certain enemies, due to the formulas of their damage vulnerability, are weaker against crit weapons than others. For example, against Acolytes, generally crit weapons are better, so that might be something to consider, but then again, the Ocucor isn't really a single target weapon either, so use whatever you like. But now that we're done talking about all the builds, there is one last topic to go over, and that would be which pistol takes the crown. Is the Ocucor stronger than the Kuva Nukor or not? And when it comes to that, it's pretty darn simple, the Kuva Nukor is simply better, period. But jokes aside, even though the Ocucor is definitely a very strong weapon and super convenient to play too, in terms of pure damage output, as you also see here, the Kuva Nukor definitely takes the crown in 2025. Reason for that is the release of the arcane Secondary Innervate with Warframe 1999. As I also said in my recent Kuva Nukor video, before the release of this arcane, you were always forced to play your Kuva Nukor with Harrow or an Adarza Kavat or at least Arcane Avenger if you wanted to see any meaningful damage from it. However, now with Secondary Innervate, I think no other weapon in the entire game benefits as much from this arcane as the Kuva Nukor does, and the increase in DPS that the weapon gains from it is very noticeable. So yeah, while the Ocucor might have been better than the Kuva Nukor in terms of DPS for the majority of 2024, since the release of Warframe 1999, this dynamic turned around. Just one thing I'd like to add here is, the auto-aiming tendril feature of the Ocucor is still super duper convenient, especially if you play maybe on mobile or on some choppy system that can only get out 15 frames per second and you're struggling to hit the broadside of a barn. Well then, yeah, the Ocucor is definitely the better one to go for. Oh yeah, and just in case you're wondering where the Tenet Cycron in this whole comparison would land, unfortunately I haven't yet had the time to properly test this one, but it's definitely something I want to do in the near future, so if you want to know more about the corpus Kuva Nukor, so to speak, then definitely stay tuned for that. And in case you haven't seen it yet, then definitely also check out my full Kuva Nukor guide right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Ondakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawki, Yagis, Hoke Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, which will probably be Lavos Prime later this week, and until then, as always, good loot.